Hi, my name is Janae Thompson, and this is my assignment, Diagnosing a Fictional Character for General Psychology. For the purpose of the assignment, I have chosen Moon Knight to diagnose. Now, Moon Knight is a Marvel character who was introduced in a series of comics related to werewolf during late slash mid 1900s. Now, he was once an antagonist, but in recent depictions of this character, he has been more of a hero or vigilante sort. And for the purposes of this assignment, I'll be mostly focusing on the TV show representation of Moon Knight and diagnosing that character. However, I will also include certain aspects from the comics that I believe show that this character's full personality and why I see him being diagnosed with these certain disorders. Now, one of the main things about Moon Knight are his multiple personalities, which I will touch on later. Now, these personalities can be dissected into Mark Spector, Stephen Grant, and Jake Lockley. For simplicity's sake, I will say that Mark Spector is the main personality, or the person who was there before everyone else. Next was Stephen Grant, and in the show, he is portrayed as more of a shy person, and he's, if I'm not mistaken, a curator at a museum. Overall, a very much an introverted person. However, Jake Lockley can be seen as the most violent of these three, acting as some sort of protector personality for these other two. Mark Spector has been and is a mercenary slash soldier, and that was both apparent in the comics and the show. And in the next slide, I will go over more about these three characters' origins and how their backstory kind of shaped up to their diagnosis. Now, Moon Knight, or Mark Spector, Stephen Grant, and Jake Lockley, whatever you may want to call them, they have a very in-depth history, both in the show and in comics themselves. Now, I want to shine a bit of light onto the show, which is like the most recent iteration of this character. Now, in the show, it doesn't shy away from his very complicated relationship with his parents. To start with his father, in the show, it showed that Stephen Graham, Jake Lockley, let's go with Mark Spector since he is the main person. Now, Mark was very close to his father as his mother and had a little brother. However, during their childhood, his little brother was killed on his watch during a flash flood when they were venturing into a cave. Now, while this was not his fault, he of course blamed himself, and unfortunately, his mother didn't blame him too. As a result of his brother's death, his mother became quite abusive towards Mark. And it was during this abuse we saw him develop his second personality, Stephen Grant. Now, Stephen Grant became very focused on Egypt and Egyptian mythology as a way to cope of the trauma of his mother abusing him. During this time, his father, while loving him and trying to support his son, didn't quite step up and protect him from this abuse and could be seen as the more passive of these two parents. And during this time, in the comics at the least, it was very heavy-handed with the message that Mark Spector and his parents were both Jewish. This was mentioned in the show, but not quite as explicitly. It was picked up on through certain cues. But back to the main point, in the comics, it was shown that religion played a very large part of this character's life. And it was in defiance of his father and the tenets of his religion, because his father was a rabbi in the comics, that he joined up with the military, more specifically the Marines. Now, this led to a whole host of problems that you would of course receive if you were to join military services. And after leaving the military, he then went on to become a mercenary, which of course will come with another host of problems due to just everything you may consider to be stereotypical of a mercenary, jumping around place to place, not having that safety guarantee, always being in a state of activation, of a state of awareness that something may kill you. And during a operation in Egypt, Mark was abandoned by his team and left to die on the sands. Now, in the show, they did a wonderful twist on this, where it displays his lack basically suicide ideations, well, not even ideations, but his willingness to die as he almost takes his life in the desert. However, at that point, he came across a statue of Khonshu, and now in Egyptian mythology, Khonshu is the moon god, and by that point, that's where Mark Spector kind of becomes this avatar, for lack of better terminology, for Khonshu. Now, his relationship with Khonshu is difficult. You could, it's almost akin to almost like a parent, but at the same time, it is a god who, of course, sees himself as above all else. And Mark is nothing more than another avatar. So the relationship is very complicated. It could go from very caring, almost wanting to protect Mark, to being very manipulative of this person, going back on promises. This is something a heavy theme in both the comics as well as the show, where Khonshu is very deceptive towards Mark and tries to keep him within his service for as long as possible. Now, another major thing that happened within the comics that was absent in the TV show was how deeply Mark's religion affected him. Beyond his father being a rabbi, in the comics there was a quite horrific scene of a young Mark having to witness his neighbor murder people just because they were Jewish. So that creates another host of problems for this character, and that's only scratching the surface of his traumatic backstory and childhood. Now, based off how I described his backstory, which was only a fraction of all that Mark Spector had seen through, is no wonder why he may have developed these symptoms or diagnoses. Now, the most obvious one is dissociative identity disorder. Now, this one's kind of clear because he did develop the personality Steve Grant as a way to cope from his mother's abuse. And furthermore, he also developed the personality of Jake Lockley, which in the show has been portrayed as being more violent, as being like the protector of these two other personalities, someone who is capable of doing the bad things that may be demanded of him as a soldier, as a mercenary, or even as a servant to Khonshu, while he does have to be actively aware that he's doing that. Now, of course, he does have suicidal tendencies, as with the scene with him in the desert and him almost taking his life. And also, he does seem to be a heavy drinker within the show. Now, as for insomnia, depression, anxiety, I want to say these are more things that could be applied to Steve Grant, the first personality that Mark Spector developed in response to his mother's abuse. In the show, Stephen Grant is shown to be basically having trouble falling asleep and not trusting himself, because at the time he didn't realize he was a personality. He wasn't the main person. He was an offshoot of Mark Spector. And of course, he dealt with mind-breaking revelations over this. And of these three personalities, he's also the one who's visibly the most anxiety riddled about the future. And of course, PTSD, I think that goes without saying, based off all the things that Mark Spector has endured throughout his life. It's no wonder why he probably would have developed PTSD just from being a soldier. But there's also a strong likelihood he developed childhood post-traumatic stress disorder from the abuse he had suffered at the hands of his mother. Because that abuse was severe enough for him to develop another personality to kind of take him away from that abuse. And now another thing the show does well is, in the show, I do believe these characters, Jake, Mark Spector, and Stephen Grant, have intermittent explosive disorder. And now this one I can make an argument for it, because the character of Jake Lockley is almost this disorder for these two other characters, as they don't remember the brief flashes in time where they saw and switched Jake Lockley, and of course they're horrified by the amount of death that this one personality causes. But at the time, they didn't realize it was another personality, so they thought they just went off the handlebars and killed a bunch of people. Now there could be 100 different treatments for this character, and in all honesty, he probably requires much more than what I have here. But this is probably the the beginning parts for this character. Now, of course, you have your medication, your antidepressants, antipsychotics, and anti-anxiety that will probably help the management of their hormones and just keeping both will keep Mark Spector, Stephen Grant, and possibly even Jake Lockley more stable long term. Now, as for the types of therapies I listen for a very specific reason. For prolonged exposure therapy is a very highly effective therapy. It's also very short, about 90 minutes, as it seeks to reduce trauma symptoms by helping individuals kind of gradually approach the source of their traumas and trauma related memories. Now, this is going to help very much with Mark Spector, seeing as though he was the original personality and was one who developed a lot of these disorders. Now, as for narrative exposure therapy, this is almost creating a timeline of a person's traumatic events in their lives. This, of course, is going to help, I would say, all three personalities as each of them kind of face their own battle and with each of these specific diagnoses, and it kind of helps them create a timeline of the things that have affected them, and kind of helps them measure how much they have affected them. And of course, this is also short term, which, if we're being realistic, is probably beneficial to a vigilante who may not have enough time to focus on their mental health. And as for cognitive behavioral therapy, I definitely see this applying a lot to Stephen Grant because he is the most physically anxious of these three personalities. And these kind of, well, of course, on top of Mark Spector obviously being suicidal. Now, cognitive behavioral therapy kind of focuses on trying to reduce the negative thoughts that someone may be feeling and kind of walks them back from the edge. For Mark Spector and Stephen Grant, I see is working perfectly because they are shown to be the most conflicted of these three personalities, and they are very much unsure of who they are, what they want to do, and also that they are the quickest to try to adapt themselves or even give up in times of hardship, as shown in the TV show. I can't speak much for the comics on this point of view, but I will hope that also applies. Also, if you see these images I have here, in the top one shows is from the TV show, and the reason why I chose this one specifically was because it kind of represents their relationship with mental health and treatments so far. For to be honest, they have very poor views of mental health and treatment in the show, and these mostly Stephen Grant and Mark Spector have these poor relationships with mental health, and they tend to shy away from it and kind of disregard it in some way. And for the bottom image, this is from comics, and unfortunately, in the comics, mental health or even the talking about health or treatment of it is very much stigmatized for these characters, seeing as though how they are treated within these facilities. So I would say the combination of these treatments will work for them specifically because a lot of these are at least the therapies are very short term, and they could do it in chunks rather than have to sit and reflect on their emotions for hours and hours, which may be a bit too difficult for them to do. Now, as for the medication, I can't see a vigilante taking them on time every day. However, there's also other options for these treatments where they could get a monthly dosage that should help them. Well, that concludes my presentation. I hope I explained effectively why I think this character should be diagnosed with these certain things, the things in their childhood has led up to these diagnoses, and the proper treatments for these diagnoses. Thank you.